Cuban Missile Crisis, October 14, 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a period of conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. The US became concerned about the Soviet Union arming Cuba, leading to a crisis. The crisis began on October 14, 1962, when American satellites reported the presence of medium-range ballistic missiles (MRBMs) in Cuba. This indicated that there was a very short time for missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads to reach the US. US President John F. Kennedy imposed an economic embargo on Cuba and decided to enforce a naval blockade to prevent the missiles from being placed in the American mainland. Kennedy addressed the American public through several televised speeches, explaining the situation and attempting to convince the world of the Soviet threat. After the discovery of missiles targeting Cuba, the US sent a letter to the Soviet Union demanding their withdrawal. The Soviet Union claimed that they had placed the missiles in Cuba to strengthen its defense and argued that it was entirely legal. As tensions escalated, both sides increased their military preparations. On October 24, the US Navy canceled plans to launch an attack on Cuba. The next day, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev sent a letter to the US, pledging to dismantle the missiles and promising that no other nuclear weapons would be placed in the American mainland. The crisis came to an end temporarily, and the brink of war was averted. However, following the end of the crisis, a series of confidence-building measures and agreements were implemented between the US and the Soviet Union. These measures aimed to prevent further crises and reduce the risk of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis is considered the greatest nuclear war threat in history. This crisis occurred at the height of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated how dangerous the use of nuclear weapons could be and encouraged the parties involved to be more cautious in controlling and limiting the spread of nuclear weapons. The crisis also served as an indication that American and Soviet leaders needed to be open to direct and indirect negotiations with each other. It highlighted the importance of strategic communication for preventing nuclear war and maintaining stability in international relations. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a source of great fear and concern for people worldwide. The crisis led to increased civil defense measures in many countries. Many people who considered the possible consequences of military conflict took into account the terrifying effects of nuclear war. During the crisis, many people attempted to continue with their daily lives, but lived with a constant sense of fear and tension. Newspapers and television's news were primary sources that people turned to in order to monitor the actions and developments of both sides. After the crisis ended, world leaders and diplomats emphasized the importance of diplomacy and negotiations to prevent similar situations from happening again. The crisis led to increased global efforts to control nuclear weapons. Restrictive and restraining agreements were signed between the United States and the Soviet Union. Additionally, the crisis encouraged the establishment of international control regimes to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The crisis revitalized peace movements around the world and strengthened reactions against nuclear energy. Research on the effects of nuclear weapons increased, and documentaries and films highlighting the devastating consequences of nuclear weapon use were produced. The crisis prompted the United Nations and other international organizations to take a more active role in preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point in the relationship between the US and the Soviet Union. Direct communication channels and the possibility of more negotiations between the two sides were established. In the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US and the Soviet Union continued to work on limited nuclear war strategies and discuss the dangers of the limited use of nuclear weapons. World leaders continued to work on post-conflict policies and strategies following the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis affected the political relations between the US and the Soviet Union and helped reduce tensions. The period of hostility between the two countries came to an end, and a more constructive dialogue was initiated. The Cuban Missile Crisis prompted many countries to be more willing to work together to control the spread of nuclear weapons. The crisis highlighted the need for nuclear powers to act more responsibly regarding conflict and war. It increased interest in global peace efforts and strengthened people's belief in nuclear disarmament. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated that it was possible to emerge from a period of fear and threat with a positive outcome. As a historical event, the Cuban Missile Crisis serves as an important guide for studying ongoing historical events and analyzing the consequences of those events. Examining and understanding the event sheds light on studies in the fields of international relations, nuclear weapons proliferation, and conflict resolution. The Cuban Missile Crisis offers many lessons and insights to be learned for successfully resolving future crises. By emphasizing the importance of diplomacy, the crisis demonstrated the need for negotiations and political solutions in place of military conflict. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, more effective measures to control the proliferation of nuclear weapons were taken by the international community.